The elderly woman's shoulders tensed as she pushed through the heavy glass doors of First National Bank. A gust of air conditioning hit her face, a welcome relief from the summer heat that had beaded sweat along her hairline. Marianne Johnson clutched her handbag closer to her side, feeling the envelope inside that contained the check. A generous gift from her son that would help fund the retirement celebration she'd been planning for months. At 68, Marianne carried herself with the dignified posture of someone who had spent decades in a classroom. 35 years of teaching mathematics had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they crinkled warmly when she smiled at the security guard who nodded in her direction. She'd been coming to this same branch for over 20 years, since before her husband passed when they'd opened their first joint account. The bank was busier than usual that Friday afternoon. Young professionals in crisp business attire stood in line, tapping away at their phones. A mother tried to quiet her restless toddler with cheerful whispers. Marianne took her place in line, patiently waiting her turn while mentally going through the list of things she needed to do before heading home. Pick up her prescription, stop by the grocery store for dinner ingredients, maybe treat herself to a pastry from the bakery down the street. When the electronic voice called teller number 4, "Please," Marianne made her way to the counter, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. The teller behind the counter was a man she hadn't seen before. Somewhat new, she guessed, with neatly combed hair and a pressed white shirt. His name tag read Richard Dawson. "Good afternoon," Marianne said with a smile, placing her ID card on the counter. "I'd like to deposit this check, please." Something shifted in Richard's expression as his eyes moved from her face to her ID, then to the envelope she was now opening. It was subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening around the mouth. "I'll need to see that check," he said, his tone noticeably cooler than the greeting he'd given the young businessman who'd just left his window. Marianne slid the check across the counter. It was a substantial amount, $25,000, a gift from her son who had insisted she use it for her retirement party, and perhaps that trip to Paris she'd always dreamed about but never thought she could afford. Richard picked up the check, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated scrutiny, his eyebrows raised as he looked at the amount. "This is quite a large sum," he commented, glancing up at her with unconcealed suspicion. "Where did you get this?" The question caught Marianne off guard. She'd deposited large checks before, when she'd sold her husband's car after he passed, when she'd received her pension payout. No one had ever questioned her like this. "It's from my son," she explained calmly, though she could feel heat rising to her cheeks. "It's a retirement gift." Richard's lips pursed as he examined the signature on the check. "Your son can afford to just give away $25,000? People in line behind Marianne had gone quiet. She could feel their eyes on her back, could sense the uncomfortable silence settling over the nearby customers. Her heart began to pound harder against her ribs. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation beginning to wash over her. "My son is quite successful." "What does he do?" Richard pressed, still holding the check up to the light as if looking for a watermark. Marianne hesitated. Her son had recently taken a new position, but he preferred to keep his success private. He'd always been that way, accomplished but humble. "He works in finance," she answered simply. Richard gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Finance," he repeated as if testing the word for lies. "And he just writes checks this large to family members? I don't see how that's relevant to depositing the check," Marianne said, her teacher's voice emerging slightly, the tone that had quieted rowdy classrooms for decades. "I've been a customer at this bank for over 20 years. A woman in line shifted uncomfortably from one foot to another. An older gentleman cleared his throat. The toddler from earlier had gone silent, sensing the tension in the air. Richard pulled out a small magnifying glass from his drawer. "We have procedures for unusual transactions, ma'am. I need to verify this isn't fraudulent." "Fraudulent?" Marianne repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Never in all her years had anyone suggested she might be trying to commit fraud. The accusation stung sharply like a physical slap. "There's been an increase in check fraud targeting this bank," Richard continued, his voice loud enough for others to hear, "especially with checks of this size." Marianne stood perfectly still, her hands now clutched tightly together. "The check is legitimate," she said firmly. "My son sent it to me last week. You can call him if you'd like." Richard ignored the offer. Instead, he typed something into his computer, his face illuminated by the blue screen light. Marianne noticed how he positioned his monitor so she couldn't see what he was doing. "Your account history doesn't show deposits of this size," he remarked, as if this was definitive evidence of wrongdoing. "Because my son doesn't give me $25,000 every day," Marianne replied, a rare edge creeping into her voice. "It's a special occasion. My retirement after 40 years of teaching." The young mother behind her in line gave Marianne a sympathetic glance. An older woman a few spots back shook her head slightly. Richard's eyes flicked to Marianne's simple dress, her worn leather handbag, as if assessing whether she looked like someone who should be handling such a large amount of money. Then he made a decision that would change everything. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I can't accept this check. It appears suspicious." Before Marianne could respond, Richard did something that made the entire bank lobby go silent. He took the check between his fingers and deliberately tore it in half. Then he tore it again. The sound of paper ripping seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed space. Marianne's mouth fell open in shock. Her hands trembled as Richard pushed the torn pieces toward her. "You can take this back and tell whoever gave it to you that we don't process fraudulent checks at this branch," he said coldly. "Next customer, please." Marianne couldn't move. The torn check, her son's generous gift, lay in pieces before her. Tears threatened, but decades of maintaining composure in front of difficult parents and troubled students had given her remarkable self-control. With as much dignity as she could muster, she gathered the torn pieces of the check and carefully placed them back in her envelope. She was aware of the eyes following her, of the whispers that had started behind cupped hands. "I would like to speak to your manager," she said quietly. "The manager is in meetings all afternoon," Richard replied dismissively. "You can make an appointment for next week if you wish." "Next customer, please." The dismissal was final. The young man waiting behind her hesitantly stepped forward, giving Marianne an apologetic glance as she turned away from the counter. The walk across the lobby felt endless. Her legs moved mechanically, carrying her toward the exit while her mind raced through what had just happened. In all her years, through the civil rights movement, through integration, through decades of fighting subtle discrimination, she had never been so openly disrespected, so publicly humiliated. Outside, the summer heat hit her again, but she barely noticed. She sat down heavily on a bench near the bank entrance, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She needed to call her son. She needed to tell him what had happened. But most of all, she needed a moment to collect herself, to process the stinging pain of being treated as if she were nothing, as if her years of hard work, her spotless reputation, her very humanity counted for nothing in the eyes of that young man behind the counter. What Marianne couldn't know, as she dialed her son's number with trembling fingers, was that the call she was about to make would set in motion events that would shake the very foundation of First National Bank. Her son, the recently appointed CEO of the bank's parent company, was about to learn how his own mother had been treated by an employee who had no idea who she really was. The sleek office on the 32nd floor of the downtown financial district hummed with quiet efficiency. Large windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline as evening approached, lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. Thomas Johnson sat behind his desk, reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed. Seeing his mother's name on the screen, his serious expression softened immediately. "Hey, Mom," he answered, leaning back in his chair. "How are you doing today?" The voice that came through the speaker wasn't the cheerful one he expected. Instead, he heard his mother's voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. "Thomas," she said, "something happened at the bank today." He listened intently as she recounted the story, his expression darkening with each detail. The check he'd sent her torn to pieces. His mother publicly humiliated. The casual cruelty of the teller who hadn't bothered to verify the check before destroying it. "He didn't even call to confirm," his mother said, her voice stronger now, fueled by indignation. "He just decided I was trying to commit fraud and ripped it up right in front of everyone." Thomas closed his eyes, his free hand curling into a fist on the polished surface of his desk. At 42, he had built his career on staying cool under pressure, on making rational decisions rather than emotional ones. But hearing the hurt in his mother's voice awakened something primal in him, the instinct to protect the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she never had. Which branch was this? he asked, his voice deliberately calm. The one on Oak Street. I've been going there for years, you know that. But I've never seen this teller before. His name tag said Richard. Thomas knew the branch well. It was the same one where his mother had opened his first savings account when he was just 10 years old, proudly depositing his paper route money every Saturday morning. The same branch where she'd helped him apply for his college loan, standing beside him with proud, anxious eyes as he signed the papers that would help fund his business degree. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Mom, he said, genuine anguish in his voice. That check was legitimate. It was from my personal account. I know that, she replied. But he looked at me like I couldn't possibly have that kind of money. Like I was trying to pull something over on them. Thomas understood what his mother wasn't explicitly saying. As a black woman in her 60s, dressed simply and without flashy jewelry or designer clothes, she had been judged and found suspicious based on her appearance alone. It was a story he had heard countless times throughout his life, had experienced himself despite his expensive suits and advanced degrees. Did you ask for the manager? He asked, already knowing the answer. The teller said the manager was in meetings all afternoon and that I could make an appointment for next week. She sighed. I was just so shocked. I gathered up the pieces of the check and left. Thomas glanced at the small framed photo on his desk. His mother at his business school graduation, beaming with pride, her arm around his shoulders. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table after his father died, who had stayed up late helping him with homework even after teaching other people's children all day, who had never once let him believe there were doors closed to him because of his race. What Thomas hadn't told his mother, what he had been planning to surprise her with at her retirement. Party next month. Was that 3 months ago? He had accepted the position of CEO at First Capital Holdings, the parent company that owned First National Bank, along with several other financial institutions across the country. After building and selling a successful financial technology company, he had been recruited to lead the traditional banking giant into the modern era. He had kept his new position relatively quiet during the transition period, working behind the scenes while the outgoing CEO handled public appearances. Only his immediate team and the board of directors knew that Thomas Johnson was now at the helm of one of the largest banking conglomerates in the country. Mom, I want you to do something for me, he said, making a decision. Do you still have the pieces of that check? Yes, I put them in an envelope. Why? I need you to keep them safe. Don't try to deposit it anywhere else. I'm going to take care of this. There was a pause on the line. Thomas, I don't want you getting all worked up about this. I know how busy you are with your new job. If only she knew just how relevant his new job was to this situation. Trust me, Mom, this is important. After reassuring his mother and making sure she was okay, Thomas ended the call and immediately pressed the intercom button on his desk. Lisa, could you come in here, please? His assistant appeared moments later, tablet in hand. I need you to pull all the security footage from the Oak Street branch of First National from today between 2 and 4 p.m. And I need the personnel file for a teller named Richard at that same branch. Lisa raised an eyebrow but nodded efficiently. Right away. May I ask what this is regarding? A customer service issue I want to look into personally. His tone made it clear that further questions weren't welcome. After she left, Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city as twilight descended. In the reflection of the glass, he could see himself, the tailored suit, the confident posture, the trappings of success that had been hard-earned through years of relentless work and determination. But today, none of that had protected his mother from humiliation. His success, his wealth, his new position of power, none of it had shielded her from being treated with suspicion and disrespect. The thought made something tighten in his chest. Thomas had faced discrimination throughout his career, the subtle kind that came wrapped in polite smiles and coded language, the kind that made people surprised when he spoke articulately in meetings or expressed shock when they learned his credentials. He had learned to navigate those waters, to pick his battles, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But his mother's experience today was different. It was blatant and cruel, a public rejection of her dignity that made his blood boil despite his attempts to remain calm. His phone buzzed again, a message from Lisa with a link to the security footage she'd already managed to access. Thomas returned to his desk and clicked the link, watching as the scene his mother had described played out on his screen. The footage had no audio, but he didn't need it. He could see everything, his mother approaching the counter with her usual dignified bearing. The teller's body language changing, becoming defensive and suspicious. The exaggerated scrutiny of the check. And then, the moment that made Thomas's jaw clench tight. The deliberate, dramatic tearing of the check, followed by his mother's visible shock and the uncomfortable reactions of other customers in line. Thomas watched as his mother gathered the pieces with trembling hands, her back straight despite the humiliation, her head held high as she walked out of the bank. Pride and anger warred within him as he replayed the footage. Another message from Lisa appeared. The personnel file of Richard Dawson, teller at the Oak Street branch for the past 8 months. Previous experience at 2 other banks. No formal complaints on record, but a note from a supervisor about overzealousness in fraud prevention that had never been followed up on. Thomas closed the file and sat in silence for a long moment, thinking carefully about what to do next. He could, with a single phone call, have Richard Dawson fired. He could publicly expose what had happened, creating a PR nightmare for the very bank he now led. He could demand immediate disciplinary action, but none of those options addressed the deeper issue, the systemic problem that had allowed this to happen in the first place. The culture that made a teller feel empowered to humiliate a customer based on assumptions and biases. The training gaps that failed to teach proper verification procedures. The leadership vacuum that permitted overzealousness to go unchecked. Thomas reached for his phone again and dialed a number. Patricia, it's Thomas. I need you to clear my morning schedule tomorrow, and I need you to set up a meeting with the branch manager at Oak Street. Don't tell them who's coming, just say it's a standard executive visit. He paused. And Patricia? Pull the customer service metrics for all our branches. I want to see if there's a pattern we need to address. As he hung up, Thomas looked again at the photo of his mother on his desk. He had always taught him to turn difficult situations into opportunities for change. Don't just get angry, she would say. Get effective. Tomorrow he would do exactly that. The bank teller who had torn up his mother's check was about to learn that the son of the woman he had humiliated wasn't just successful in finance. He was the CEO of the entire banking system. But more importantly, the bank itself was about to undergo a transformation that would ensure no one else's mother would ever experience what Marianne Johnson had endured today. Morning. Light streamed through the windows of First National Bank's Oak Street branch as staff prepared for opening. The branch manager, Diane Porter, straightened her blazer nervously as she briefed her team about the executive visit scheduled for that day. All I know is that someone from the corporate office is coming for an evaluation, she explained to the gathered employees. These visits typically happen without warning, so we should be grateful we got any notice at all. Among the assembled staff, Richard Dawson suppressed a yawn. Executive visits didn't concern him much. In his experience, the suits from corporate rarely paid attention to individual tellers. They looked at numbers, not people. Besides, he'd been commended just last month for his vigilance in preventing fraud attempts. Remember, Diane continued, everyone should be on their best behavior. Follow all protocols to the letter. Her eyes swept across the room, and provide excellent customer service to everyone who walks through those doors. As the staff dispersed to their stations, Diane returned to her office to review yesterday's transactions. A small frown crossed her face as she scanned the incident report Richard had filed about a potential fraud attempt. Something about a suspiciously large check that he'd rejected. She made a mental note to discuss his approach with him later. While she appreciated his attention to security, customer complaints about his manner had increased in recent months. At precisely 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes after opening, the glass doors of the bank swung open to admit a man whose presence immediately commanded attention. Tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth, he carried a leather portfolio under one arm. The security guard straightened instinctively as the man approached. Good morning, the visitor said, his voice pleasant but authoritative. I'm here to see Diane Porter. The guard directed him to the manager's office, and within moments Diane emerged, extending her hand with a professional smile. Welcome to our branch. I'm Diane Porter, the manager. You must be from corporate. The man returned her handshake with a firm grip. Thomas Johnson, he replied simply. Thank you for accommodating this meeting on short notice. If he noticed how Diane's eyes widened slightly at his name, he gave no indication. Instead, he followed her into her office, closing the door behind them. Inside the office, Thomas declined the offered coffee and sat across from Diane, placing his portfolio on the desk between them. "Ms. Porter," he began, "I'd like to discuss an incident that occurred in your branch yesterday afternoon." Diane's smile faltered slightly. "Of course. Which incident are you referring to?" "A customer attempted to deposit a check for $25,000. Your teller, Richard Dawson, determined it was fraudulent and destroyed it in front of the customer and other patrons." Realization dawned on Diane's face. "Yes, I saw the report this morning. One of our tellers followed fraud prevention protocols with a suspicious transaction." Thomas opened his portfolio and removed a folder. "I'd like to show you something." He placed several printed images from the security footage on the desk. "These stills are from your security cameras. They show the interaction quite clearly." Diane leaned forward to examine the images. They showed an elderly black woman at Richard's window, followed by the teller's increasingly aggressive body language, and finally, the woman's evident distress as she collected torn pieces of paper from the counter. The customer in question is a 68-year-old retired school teacher who has banked at this branch for over 20 years, Thomas said calmly. The check was from her son's personal account. It was a retirement gift. Diane shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Dawson was following our fraud prevention protocols. Large checks from unfamiliar sources require additional verification. Additional verification, Thomas repeated, such as calling the issuing bank, contacting the account holder, consulting a manager. Which of these verification steps did Mr. Dawson take before destroying a legitimate check? The question hung in the air. Diane glanced down at the images again, particularly at the one showing the elderly woman's straight back as she walked away. Dignity intact, despite her obvious humiliation. I don't believe he took those steps, she admitted finally. No, he didn't, Thomas confirmed. Instead, he made a judgment based on appearances and assumptions. He decided, within moments of this customer approaching his window, that her transaction must be fraudulent. He leaned forward slightly. What I'm curious about, Ms. Porter, is why you're characterizing this as following protocols when it clearly was not. Diane's professional demeanor wavered. Mr. Johnson, I can assure you that we take customer service very seriously at this branch. If there was a lapse in protocol, we will address it immediately. I've reviewed your customer service metrics, Thomas continued, pulling another document from his portfolio. Did you know that complaints have increased 37% at this branch over the past 6 months? And that 62% of those complaints came from customers of color? The color drained from Diane's face. I wasn't aware of that specific breakdown. That's concerning, especially since that data is included in your quarterly performance reports. Thomas's voice remained measured, but his eyes were intense. Now I'd like to speak with Richard Dawson, please. 10 minutes later, Richard sat stiffly in the chair Diane had vacated. She had introduced Thomas only as an executive from corporate here about yesterday's incident before excusing herself at Thomas's request. Richard's initial confidence had quickly evaporated under Thomas's steady gaze. Now he fidgeted with his tie as Thomas silently reviewed the incident report. Mr. Dawson, Thomas said finally, walk me through your decision-making process yesterday when Marianne Johnson approached your window. Richard straightened. I noticed a customer attempting to deposit an unusually large check. Following security protocols, I examined the check for signs of fraud. When I determined it was suspicious, I rejected it. And what made it suspicious? The amount was unusual compared to her typical transactions, and the signature seemed off. Did you call the issuing bank to verify the check? Richard hesitated. No. Did you ask for a manager's opinion? No, but did you suggest the customer wait while you verified the authenticity through proper channels? There wasn't. Mr. Dawson, Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. What you're describing is not following protocol. It's making a snap judgment based on what you thought you saw. Richard's face flushed. Sir, with all due respect, I've prevented several fraud attempts in my time here. My instincts are usually correct. Usually, Thomas repeated. But not yesterday. He pushed one of the security camera images toward Richard. The woman whose check you destroyed has banked here for decades. The check you determined was fraudulent came from her son's account. He paused. A son who happens to work in finance. Richard swallowed hard, looking down at the image of Marianne Johnson's face. frozen in a moment of shock and humiliation. "I was just trying to protect the bank," he said, his voice smaller now. "Were you?" Thomas asked. "Or were you making assumptions about what kind of customer could legitimately have access to that amount of money?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to formulate a response. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying the young man across from him. Richard wasn't much older than 30, with the kind of confidence that often came from privilege rather than experience. There was no malice in his face, just the uncomfortable realization that he'd been caught making a mistake. "Do you know why I'm here personally, Mr. Dawson?" Thomas asked. Richard shook his head. "Marianne Johnson is my mother." The color drained from Richard's face. His eyes darted to the door as if calculating an escape route. "And 3 months ago," Thomas continued, "I became the CEO of First Capital Holdings, the parent company of this bank." Richard seemed to shrink in his chair. "Sir, I had no idea." Thomas held up a hand. "That's precisely the point. You had no idea who she was, so you felt comfortable treating her with disrespect. You had no idea that the check you tore up in front of an audience of other customers was from me personally." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "But here's what bothers me most. Would it have mattered if you had known? Should a person's treatment in this bank depend on who they know or who their children are?" The question wasn't really meant for Richard to answer, and he didn't try. Thomas gathered his documents back into the portfolio. "I came here today not as Marianne Johnson's son, but as the CEO of a company failing to live up to its values. What happened to my mother happens to people every day who don't have a son in a position to demand answers." Richard's eyes remained fixed on the desk. "I'll be meeting with your branch manager again to discuss next steps," Thomas said, standing. "In the meantime, I suggest you take some time to reflect on your approach to customer service and the assumptions that guide your decision-making." As Thomas turned to leave, Richard finally found his voice. "Sir, am I being fired?" Thomas paused at the door. "That would be the easy solution, wouldn't it? Replace one person and pretend the problem is solved." He shook his head. "No, Mr. Dawson. What happened yesterday isn't just about you. It's about a culture that allowed your behavior to seem acceptable, and fixing that requires more than removing one employee." He stepped out of the office, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his actions and the unsettling realization that the woman he had humiliated was the mother of the most powerful person in the company. In the main lobby, customers were beginning to fill the space, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in the manager's office where Thomas had now rejoined Diane. As they talked, Thomas watched the everyday operations of the bank through the office windows, the interactions between staff and customers, the subtle dynamics of who received immediate attention and who was made to wait, the assumptions made visible in body language and facial expressions. What had happened to his mother was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that would require more than disciplinary action to address. As CEO, he now had the power to make real, lasting changes, not just for his mother, but for every customer who walked through these doors expecting fair and respectful treatment. The real work was just beginning. The conference room on the 32nd floor of the HOA First Capital Holdings Tower buzzed with nervous energy. 12 branch managers from across the city sat around the long table, folders neatly arranged before them, wondering why they'd been summoned for this unexpected meeting. At the head of the table, Thomas's executive assistant arranged water glasses and checked that the presentation equipment was working properly. Diane Porter sat rigidly in her chair, avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. 2 days had passed since Thomas Johnson's visit to her branch, and the rumors had already begun circulating. An incident at Oak Street, the new CEO personally involved, possible restructuring on the horizon. She had spent those 48 hours reviewing customer complaint records with growing dismay, patterns emerging that she had somehow missed, or perhaps chosen not to see, during her 3 years as branch manager. The door opened, and conversations immediately hushed as Thomas entered the room. He wore the same understated confidence as during his branch visit, though today his suit was navy rather than charcoal. Behind him followed 3 people: the chief operating officer, the head of human resources, and an African-American woman in her 50s whom none of the managers recognized. "Good morning," Thomas began, taking his place at the head of the table, Thank you all for rearranging your schedules on such short notice. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elaine Washington, who will be joining our leadership team as the newly created Chief Customer Experience Officer. The woman beside him nodded in acknowledgement. I look forward to working with all of you, she said in a warm, measured voice. Though I wish the circumstances that expedited my appointment were different. Thomas remained standing as his assistant distributed new folders to everyone present. 2 days ago, I visited the Oak Street branch after receiving reports of a concerning incident involving a longtime customer. What I found wasn't just a single case of poor customer service. It was evidence of a systemic failure in how we approach our fundamental mission as a financial institution. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him came to life, displaying graphs and statistics. These numbers represent customer complaints across all our branches over the past 12 months. As you can see, there's a disturbing pattern. The room was silent as the managers studied the data. Several exchanged uncomfortable glances. What's most troubling, Thomas continued, is that when we break down these complaints by demographic factors, clear disparities emerge. Another slide appeared, showing how complaint rates correlated with customers' racial backgrounds, ages, and apparent socioeconomic status. We are systematically providing different levels of service to different types of customers. One of the managers, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, customer perceptions can be subjective. Some people are more likely to complain than others. Thomas nodded. A fair point, Mr. Ramirez. Which is why we also analyzed concrete metrics like wait times, approval rates for similar transactions, and instances where additional verification was requested. He clicked to the next slide. The disparities remain consistent. Dr. Washington stepped forward. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, she said. Many of these biases operate unconsciously. They're embedded in our systems, our training, and yes, our culture. The challenge now is acknowledging they exist and addressing them directly. Diane's face had grown increasingly pale as she studied the data. The patterns at her branch were even more pronounced than the system-wide averages. How had she missed this? Or had she simply accepted it as normal, as the way things had always been? I'm not here to make speeches, Thomas said, taking a seat at last. I'm here to announce a series of immediate changes to how our bank operates. He opened his folder and gestured for the managers to do the same. First, we're implementing a comprehensive review of all customer service protocols, with particular attention to how we verify unusual transactions. The head of HR spoke up. Beginning next week, every employee, from tellers to regional directors, myself included, will participate in implicit bias training developed by Dr. Washington's team. Second, Thomas continued, we're establishing a new customer advocacy department that will report directly to Dr. Washington. This team will conduct regular audits using mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds to ensure consistent service quality for all customers. One by one, Thomas outlined the changes: revised transaction protocols, new customer feedback mechanisms, a community advisory board made up of representatives from various neighborhoods served by the bank, and a complete overhaul of performance metrics to include equity of service as a key indicator. Finally, Thomas said, his tone becoming more personal, I want to share something with you. He clicked to a new slide, showing a photograph of his mother, Mary Ann Johnson, the woman whose check had been torn up at the Oak Street branch. She stood in front of a classroom of students, a math equation on the blackboard behind her. This is my mother. She taught mathematics for 35 years, helping thousands of young people understand complex concepts and believe in their own abilities. 2 years ago, she was named Teacher of the Year by the State Education Board. She's banked with us for decades, maintained perfect credit, and never once overdrew her account. He clicked again, and security footage from the bank appeared. The moment when Richard tore up her check, frozen in time. This is how she was treated when she tried to deposit a retirement gift from her son. Thomas's voice remained even, professional, but the emotion behind his words was unmistakable, not because she violated any policy or because the check was actually suspicious, but because of assumptions made about who she was and what she deserved. The room was completely silent now. I share this not to single out one branch or one employee, but to make something very clear. This could have happened at any of our locations. And for customers without a son who happens to be CEO, it probably happens more often than we know. Dr. Washington stepped forward again. This incident is going to serve as a case study in our new training program. Not to shame anyone, but to help everyone understand how these moments happen and how we can prevent them. Thomas closed his folder. We're going to talk more specifically with each of you about implementation in your individual branches. But first, I want to hear your thoughts and questions about these initiatives. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Diane Porter straightened in her chair. Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for what happened at my branch. There's no excuse. After reviewing our records, I can see patterns I should have addressed long ago. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, Ms. Porter. Recognizing the problem is the first step toward solving it. If I may, said another manager, a younger woman from the West Side branch. I think many of us have been focused so much on fraud prevention and efficiency metrics that we've lost sight of the human element of banking. These changes feel overdue. Gradually, the conversation opened up. Some managers expressed concerns about implementation timelines or resource allocation, while others shared their own observations of inconsistent service. The discussion became more candid as it progressed, with several managers acknowledging that they too had seen evidence of differential treatment, but hadn't known how to address it. Throughout the meeting, Thomas listened more than he spoke, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. This wasn't just about implementing new policies. It was about changing a culture, and that would require buy-in from the people in this room. As the meeting drew to a close 2 hours later, Thomas stood once more. I want to be clear about something. This isn't just a PR exercise or a reaction to one incident. This is about who we are as an institution and what we stand for. Every person who walks through our doors deserves respect, dignity, and fair treatment, regardless of their appearance, background, or the size of their account. He paused, looking around the room. Some of you may be wondering about the Oak Street teller involved in the incident with my mother. Richard Dawson has been placed on administrative leave while we assess next steps. But firing one employee won't solve the underlying issues we've identified today. Our focus needs to be on systemic change. The managers began gathering their materials, the mood in the room now thoughtful rather than nervous. One last thing, Thomas said as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow morning I'll be meeting with my mother at the Oak Street branch. Not as the CEO, but as her son to help her deposit a new check. I'd like to invite any of you who can make it to join us. Not for publicity, there won't be any press, but as a symbolic fresh start for how we serve all our customers. As the managers filed out, Dr. Washington approached Thomas. That went better than expected, she observed. But the real test will be implementing these changes at the ground level. Cultural transformation doesn't happen overnight. Thomas nodded. I know, but it has to start somewhere. He looked again at the frozen image still displayed on the screen, his mother's face, showing the dignified hurt of someone who had experienced such moments before. And for us, it starts with making this right. The next morning, Thomas stood beside his mother as she entered the Oak Street branch. The space had been subtly transformed. Fresh flowers on the counters, new signage emphasizing the bank's commitment to serving the community, and staff who greeted every customer with genuine attention. Diane Porter herself approached them, extending her hand to Marianne. Mrs. Johnson, welcome back to First National. We're honored to have you here today. Marianne, elegant in a simple blue dress, accepted the handshake with gracious dignity. Thank you, she said simply. As they walked toward the counter where a new teller waited with a respectful smile, Thomas watched his mother's straight back, her head held high. She had taught him many things throughout his life: determination, excellence, integrity. But perhaps her greatest lesson was this moment right here. How to walk back into a place that had humiliated you, not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet power of someone who knows their worth cannot be diminished by another's misjudgment. The transformation of First National Bank was just beginning. But in that moment, watching his mother sign her name with steady hands, Thomas knew they were already taking the first, crucial steps toward becoming the institution they always should have been. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Marianne Johnson's check was torn to pieces. The Oak Street branch of First National Bank looked different now, not just in its physical appearance, with its warmer lighting and more welcoming layout, but in the very atmosphere that greeted customers as they entered. On this particular Wednesday morning, Marianne herself pushed through the glass doors, her familiar canvas tote bag over her shoulder. At 68, she moved with the same dignified grace she had carried throughout her life, though there was something different about her now. A quiet confidence that came from knowing she had been part of catalyzing important change. "Good morning." "Mrs. Johnson," called the security guard, a middle-aged man who had been with the bank for over a decade. "Beautiful day out there." "It certainly is, Robert," she replied with a warm smile. "How's that granddaughter of yours doing?" "Growing like a weed." Already talking about college, if you can believe it. This easy human exchange was one of many small transformations that had taken place at the bank. 6 months ago, such personal conversations rarely happened. Now they were encouraged as part of the bank's renewed focus on building genuine relationships with the community it served. Marianne glanced at the wall near the entrance where a new plaque hung. "Community Advisory Board meeting, today at 10 a.m. Her name was listed among the board members, alongside representatives from local businesses, non-profit organizations, and various neighborhoods throughout the city. As she made her way to the meeting room at the back of the bank, several employees greeted her by name. The branch manager, Diane Porter, emerged from her office to walk alongside her. "We have quite a turnout for today's presentation," Diane said. "People are excited to hear about the changes we've implemented." Marianne nodded. "It's been quite a journey these past few months." That was an understatement. What had begun as a painful personal incident had transformed into something much larger, a complete overhaul of how First National Bank approached customer service and community engagement. And Marianne, rather than remaining simply the CEO's mother who was wronged, had become a central figure in that transformation. The meeting room was indeed full. About 30 people sat around tables arranged in a U-shape, bank employees, community members, and even a few people from other financial institutions who had come to learn about First National's new approach. At the front of the room stood Thomas, looking both professional and approachable in a suit without a tie. Beside him was Dr. Washington, the bank's chief customer experience officer, reviewing notes on her tablet. As Marianne entered, Thomas looked up and smiled at his mother. Their relationship had taken on new dimensions over these past months as they worked together in this unexpected way. He had always respected her wisdom, but seeing her translate her decades of classroom experience into valuable insights for corporate policy had given him a new appreciation for her abilities. Once everyone was settled, Thomas stepped forward to open the meeting. "Thank you all for coming today. 6 months ago, we began a journey to transform not just how our bank operates, but how we think about our fundamental purpose in the communities we serve." He glanced at his mother. "That journey began with an incident that revealed serious flaws in our approach, an incident that happened to directly affect my family, but which represented experiences that many customers had faced over the years." There were nods around the room. Many knew the story by now, how the elderly mother of the new CEO had her check torn up by a teller who assumed she was committing fraud, and how that moment had sparked a company-wide reckoning. "Today, we're not here to dwell on past mistakes," Thomas continued. "We're here to share the concrete changes we've implemented, the results we've measured, and the lessons we've learned. And I'm going to let Dr. Washington and our Community Advisory Board take the lead in that presentation." He stepped back, yielding the floor to Dr. Washington. This too was part of the change, the CEO who listened more than he spoke, who elevated other voices rather than dominating every conversation. Dr. Washington pulled up the first slide of her presentation. "When we began this process, we identified 3 key areas for immediate intervention: staff training, policy reform, and community engagement. Let's look at what we've accomplished in each area." The presentation that followed was detailed but engaging, filled with both data and human stories. Dr. Washington explained how every employee, from tellers to executives, had completed a comprehensive training program on implicit bias and inclusive customer service, how transaction verification protocols had been standardized to ensure consistent treatment for all customers, regardless of appearance or account size, how mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds now regularly evaluated service quality across all branches. Throughout the presentation, various members of the Community Advisory Board offered their perspectives. A small business owner described how the new small business lending practices had made it possible for him to expand his neighborhood grocery store. A retired postal worker explained how the revised elder banking program had made banking more accessible for seniors. When it was Marianne's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt as she gathered her thoughts. "I never expected to find myself here," she began, her teacher's voice easily filling the room without needing to raise it. "For most of my life, banking was simply something I did, a necessary errand between the grocery store and the pharmacy. I didn't expect it to be pleasant or unpleasant. I just expected it to be done correctly." She paused, looking around at the attentive faces. "The day my check was torn up, I felt something that too many people feel when interacting with financial institutions. I felt invisible. Or rather, I felt visible only as a stereotype, not as a human being with a history, with dignity, with the right to be treated with respect." Several people nodded in recognition of this experience. "What's remarkable is not that this happened. Such things happen every day to people who don't have a son in a position of influence. What's remarkable is what happened afterward." She gestured to the room, to the presentation, to the changes documented in the handouts before them. Instead of treating it as an isolated incident to be swept under the rug with an apology, and perhaps a firing, this bank chose to see it as a symptom of deeper issues that needed addressing. She turned slightly toward her son, a hint of pride in her eyes. "And that has made all the difference." As Marianne returned to her seat, a woman raised her hand from the back of the room. She was in her 30s, professionally dressed with a portfolio in front of her. "I'm from City Trust Bank across town," she said when called on. "What you've described is impressive but also expensive and time-consuming. How do you justify these investments to your shareholders? Have you seen any return on investment yet?" It was a fair question, the kind that would have been asked in any business meeting. Thomas stepped forward to answer it, pulling up a new slide with financial data. "That's an excellent question," he said, "and the answer might surprise you. In the 6 months since implementing these changes, our customer retention rates have increased by 23%. New account openings are up 17%, with particularly strong growth in communities where we previously had low market penetration." He flipped to another chart. "But perhaps most telling is this. Employee satisfaction and retention have improved dramatically. Our turnover rate, which was 34% annually, has dropped to less than 12%, Dr. Washington added. "It turns out that employees prefer working for an institution they can be proud of, one where they're empowered to truly serve customers rather than just process transactions." The meeting continued with more questions, more discussions, and finally, a tour of the renovated branch to see the changes in action. As the group moved through the main lobby, they passed the teller windows where everyday banking continued. At one window stood a familiar face, Richard Dawson, the teller who had torn up Marianne's check 6 months earlier. Many had expected Richard to be fired immediately after the incident. Instead, after his period of administrative leave, he had requested to be part of the transformation process. With Thomas's approval, he had become one of the most dedicated participants in the new training programs and had asked specifically to be part of the team developing revised verification protocols. As the tour group passed his window, Richard looked up briefly, meeting Marianne's eyes. There was no dramatic moment, no theatrical apology that had happened privately months ago. Instead, there was simply a respectful nod of acknowledgement between two people who had found themselves at the center of a story that grew larger than either of them. After the meeting concluded, Thomas and Marianne sat in the small courtyard behind the bank, taking a moment of quiet before returning to their respective responsibilities. Solve problems by understanding the underlying structures. This doesn't feel so different. She turned back to her son. Besides, your father always said that when someone wrongs you, you have two choices. You can just get angry, or you can channel that anger into making sure it doesn't happen to someone else. I think he'd be proud of what we've done here. Thomas nodded, remembering his father's wisdom. Gone now for 15 years, but still influencing their lives. The real test, Marianne continued, will be whether these changes last beyond the immediate response to one incident. Will this bank still be operating this way in 5 years? Will other banks follow your example? That's why your role on the advisory board is so important, Thomas said. You help keep us accountable. Marianne patted her son's hand. That's always been my job, hasn't it? Keeping you accountable, pushing you to do your best. She smiled. Even when you became the big CEO, some things don't change. As they gathered their things to leave, Marianne looked back at the bank building, with its new welcome sign in multiple languages and the comings and goings of a diverse stream of customers. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something powerful and lasting, not just a lesson about banking, but about how institutions could change when brave people insisted on being seen as fully human. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still improvements to be made, still mindsets to be shifted, but for the first time, Marianne felt like she wasn't just a customer at this bank. She was a valued community member with a voice that mattered, and so was everyone else who walked through those doors. That, more than anything else, was the real transformation.